On this episode, I speak with two filmmakers who have worked in comedy and bring that experience to their new documentaries, The Last Republican and Will and Harper. I'm Thom Powers, and this is Pure Nonfiction. I'm recording this introduction 2 days after Donald Trump was reelected as president. The election reminds us that there are multiple narratives about the United States. Two new documentaries give very different perspectives from Donald Trump's version, and they both have a sense of humor. I recorded these conversations in mid-October at the Documentary Spotlight event in Los Angeles, co-presented by Pure Nonfiction and The Ankler. My first interview is with Steve Pink. He has a long career working in comedy as a co-writer of Grosse Pointe Blank and High Fidelity, and he directed Hot Tub Time Machine. Now he's made his first documentary called The Last Republican about the Illinois Congressman Adam Kinzinger, who was horrified by the insurrection on January 6th and voted to impeach Donald Trump. Adam was convinced that this was the moment for the Republican Party to change course. Instead, he found himself isolated from his own party and realized he had no path to run for re-election. Steve Pink is a Hollywood liberal who shares almost nothing politically with Adam, but they're both from Illinois, and Steve grew curious about what it meant for Adam to take a stand against Trump. It turned out that Adam is a big fan of Hot Tub Time Machine, so they shared a sense of humor, and that became a common ground to discuss political differences. The film reminds us of a moment when Republicans might have broken away from Trump. We hear statements soon after January 6th made by Republican House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy and Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell.
He should have immediately denounced the mob when he saw what was unfolding. These facts require immediate action by President Trump.
President Trump is practically and morally responsible for provoking the events of the day. No question about it.
Only a few weeks later, the tone changed as the Republican Party fell back in line with Trump. But not Adam, who served on the January 6th congressional investigation. Steve's film follows Adam over that year as he was ostracized by friends and even family members while also receiving death threats. In this clip from the film, we hear Adam discuss with Steve how he thought the Republicans would finally sober up after January 6th.
I called it was like Saturday morning when you had a giant party at your house Friday night and now you got chickens flying around, you have a bad headache, you're only wearing a shirt and you're like, what did we do last night? That's where I thought the party was.
So your thinking, even at that moment, was the insurrection and the attempt to overthrow the government in a coup d'etat that included 140 Republicans voting to not certify the election. You thought that just might have been a crazy bender and that they were going to wake up and get their shit together.
Yep. You're going to wake up, you're going to deal with the hangover, and you're going to gut it out and drink water, right? Donald Trump was a non-entity. Nobody even showed up at Andrews when he left. But you can always fix a hangover by starting to drink again. And that's when Kevin McCarthy goes to Mar-a-Lago. That changed everything.
The Last Republican premiered in September at the Toronto International Film Festival. It's qualified for this year's Oscars and is still looking for a distributor. When I sat down with Adam in Los Angeles last month, I asked what drew him to make the film.
I've always been a political junkie. I wanted to find my way into a political subject, but I was like, not this one, because, as a progressive, I wasn't interested. But it was hard to deny, a story about a guy who blew up a lot of his life, to stand on principle. And I lived my life as a skeptic, like you can see in that clip. I was genuinely amazed that he thought that the Republicans would, kind of reset themselves and uphold their oath, and then somehow, the two-party system would reestablish itself under some kind of order. And I was like, that's bananas. Like, that was never going to happen. And so it was interesting to me that for someone to live his life in a way where he really truly believes in upholding his oath, and he thought that people would do likewise.
One of the things we see in this film is that you are able to have a dialogue, and increasingly in the United States, people are isolated in their own bubbles, talking to people who only agree with them. What did you learn from that experience of talking to someone who is your political opposite?
First, I wasn't thinking about it at all. I was like, this is it was a profile in courage. There is the Jan 6 hearings were looming, and following Adam through that experience was kind of the direction of the documentary. But we would find ourselves obviously in all these moments together when I wasn't shooting or even when I was shooting. And I at first had the urge to, I don't know, maybe, I don't really know why. There's a certain aspect of me, maybe it's the hot tub time machine effect that feels like belligerent in some way. And I really was like, well, here's this lawmaker in front of me. And even though I'm just an average fellow, I'm going to press him on all these things that are truly important to me in terms of like my political positions and my view of the world. And it was really hard at first, right? Because I wasn't very good at it, right? I was like, you're wrong in all these ways. Don't you see that? Like, how could you hold these conservative positions in any category? And as we got to be friends, it actually became much, much easier, which I know seems very, very obvious, but the more at ease we were with each other and the more common ground that we found we had, whether it was through comedy or whatever, we were able to really dive into issues, and I could really express myself properly in terms of how I disagreed with him and why and what's to be done about it. And so I really learned that the more that we understood that we were arguing in good faith and that he was a good person and he meant well and he had people's best interests at heart, even though we had very different views. You could really dig in and it could get even more heated because I knew that at the end of the day we could trust each other in some way.
I mean, he was undergoing a lot in this period. Maybe you can just elaborate on all the pressures he was getting.
Well, he really did lose all his friends. He really did lose. There's a whole set of his relatives who felt it necessary to write a letter to the New York Times disowning him. Like, I hope my Aunt Adele doesn't do that, at any point. Like, you really have to really, to actually take that step. He's in the Air Force. His co-pilot on missions in the Air Force actually also publicly came out and said, this desire to come out and tell Adam that he's a terrible person by virtue of his willingness to stand up. So he really felt those losses. His wife, Sophia, was pregnant at the time, and here he is sacrificing his job, right? He immediately lost his job and he got kicked out of the party. And so he really felt isolated, and I could feel that.
To be clear, he chose not to run again because it was quite obvious that there was...
Yeah, because he was actually, at our very first day of shooting, actually, he was shooting this commercial about the importance of, finding common ground, ironically. And it was the Illinois Democrats, by virtue of the census, combined his district with a MAGA Republican. So he knew going a street fight with a MAGA Republican in his district, wasn't going to be, successful. So he had essentially he realized in that moment he had to end his career or fight that particular fight. But it was as a direct result of his, of the decisions he had made over the course of the 9 months before that.
Yeah, and so what did you filmed him over several months while he gets put onto the congressional investigation of January 6th, not something that he volunteered for, but something that Nancy Pelosi volunteered him for, as we see in the film, and. Can you talk about, what you were witnessing in his life at that time?
Well, he felt after he came out and said that they should enact the 25th Amendment, right, and throw Trump out of office, and then he votes for impeachment, and then he could see that, he could see the consequence of that right away. And it wasn't for a few months when the committee started forming that he had to even make a decision about what he was going to do. And so by that point, he really felt that he had done his job. Right, he stood up. He knew he was leaving Congress, and so he didn't want to be on the committee necessarily. Like he was outspoken in his way, and Pelosi. You'll see in the film, Pelosi actually did, volunteer him to be in it. But the story that's not in the film is that Jamie Raskin is across from him in his congressional office. They have offices across from each other, and so they were friendly in some way. And so, the Democrats actually, went and prepped it. They wanted to find out. So Jamie in the hallway just kind of casually said, "Hey, Adam, they're thinking about maybe naming you to the committee, and what would you feel about that?" And he said, "Well, I would never volunteer, but I would absolutely have to serve if I was asked." So in that moment, he,
Ding!
yeah, it was actually just that weekend. That was on a Friday, and on Sunday, Nancy Pelosi announced that Adam would be part of the committee before he spoke with Adam.
You have this other Hollywood career. This is your first time making a documentary. What has that been like?
Well, first, even sitting here, I will say, as a first-time documentary filmmaker, I have to say that I'm honored to be here amongst really extraordinary filmmakers, who are telling incredible stories, and I'm really excited to celebrate and watch all of their movies. To do, as a director in comedy, it's just a very different enterprise, in so many different ways, not least of which is how I'm approaching any particular scene, having a camera in reality and trying to find what story I'm telling in that moment was a totally new and different experience for me, and incredibly exciting and terrifying mostly. Trying to create laughs is terrifying in its own way, but eventually, if you have brilliant comedic actors on the floor,
it easier.
Yeah, it's like it's much, much easier. And so that was an extraordinary experience for me, to be in a space with a camera and just trying to figure out a way to capture the experience of the people in front of me.
For the second half of this podcast, we're talking about the film Will and Harper, about Will Ferrell and his friend Harper Steele. After Harper came out as a transgender woman, the two of them drove across America to process this stage in their friendship and for Harper to experience the country in a new way. In this bit from the trailer, we hear from Will and then Harper.
A long time ago, back when I was at Saturday Night Live, I met a guy who was hired as a writer the same week I was hired. He wrote a bunch of sketches for me and eventually became the head writer of SNL. And over the years, he became one of my closest friends. And then one day, I got this email. "Hey, Will, something I need you to know. I'll be transitioning to live as a woman."
I don't doubt that Will is my friend, but I'm not Andrew Steele anymore.
It was just, whoa.
I love this country so much, I just don't know if it loves me back right now.
Harper, would you want to do a road trip as this new version of yourself and at the same time figure out what this all means to us?
Will and Harper played at the Sundance and Toronto Film Festivals and is now streaming on Netflix. The director is Josh Greenbaum, who previously made the documentary The Short Game about child golfers aspiring to turn pro. He also directed the comedy Barb and Star Go to Vista del Mar, starring Kristen Wiig and Annie Mumolo. I asked Josh how he got to make Will and Harper.
It's the first doc I've ever made where I knew my subjects beforehand and were friends with them, and they actually approached me, which was really interesting. So I've known Will for about 8 years now. We've worked on some projects together. He produced my first narrative feature called Barb and Star Go to Vista del Mar, which is fun. Thank you. Sorry, that sounded shameless, but it's just how I know Will. Yeah, so I've known Will for about 8 years, and I've known Harper for about 4. I met her through Kristen Wiig, who's a mutual friend. And so when Will had this idea for this road trip, because Harper has done these trips her whole life, but had not yet done one since she transitioned, Will had proposed the idea, and it took Harper a little while to come around to it. But once she did, they were trying to figure out, is this a documentary? And if so, who would be right to film this and direct it? And so they, reached out to me, and I think really a huge part of the reason why it made sense, for a lot of reasons, but they needed a safe space to be able to open up, to feel vulnerable. I also know to them, a lot like Steve was just talking about, comedy is their love language. But it's also so critical that the film itself, I think, as we started to have early conversations, captured that and was funny. And so I think there was a safety there as well. And they had seen a lot of my previous documentaries as well and like those. And so it started, in a really interesting kind of organic way, in a very familial way, which is very different than all the other docs I've ever made. And then as we got into production, that started to pose some challenging questions for me, where all of a sudden, I'm always protective of my subjects in my films, but there's another layer all of a sudden when you want to keep filming something that is difficult and uncomfortable, but it's also a friend on the other side. And so that was new. That was all new territory to me.
So you've got two incredible assets because you've got two very funny people that you're filming, but you also have different kind of pressure. It's like a 20-day road trip, so you've got and I think they probably have busy careers, so you're not going to keep filming much beyond those 20 days. Did that feel like a pressure?
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe Will wasn't that busy. Yeah, there was a million pieces of pressure you think about. It's like, I'm sure all the other doc filmmakers out here, there's this degree of like trying to plan and trying to have some degree of a roadmap, and obviously in our case a little roadmap, but then there's also this degree that you want to let go and just see where the story takes you. And so that was always a balancing act, I think. I immediately put the literal roadmap in Harper's hands and said, hey, these are the trips you do. Let me know where you think you'd want to go so we can at least have a little bit of a sense of where we're headed. And she picked out certain things. We start in New York City, where they met at Saturday Night Live 30 years ago. They started the exact same day. And that enabled us to kind of start their story from where it began, and then we made our way out west. So she kind of had that mapped out, but there was I kept my crew incredibly small so that we could, on any given day when they saw something and they were like, ooh, let's go here, let's go there, we could try to accommodate. And but yeah, there was a lot of, I think I had a couple really big fears going in and challenges I knew of. One was just like, I wasn't sure to the degree which they would open up and be vulnerable. Anybody who works in comedy knows that comedians tend to, as soon as things get a little bit deep, just pull the ripcord and go back to a joke. And so that was a concern of mine. And I think somewhat founded early on, where there was, if you watch the film, there's a little bit of a tightness and a stiffness and a feeling of like staying in the joke for a long time. But just like any good road trip does, it's there's a vulnerability that just inevitably opens itself up. I think there's something about sitting and not facing one another that also really helps. I've had people tell me I have kids, and they're like, if you ever have to have a hard conversation with your kids, do it in the car, also because they're locked in. But it's that like you're not looking one another in the eye, and so that fear, I think, ultimately was assuaged. The most interesting one was this was also the first doc where I'm not the one in direct contact with my subjects, right? So the conversation is happening between them, which was beautiful. But I started to realize, oh, right, they don't maybe have some of the techniques and tools that many of us here in this room know. So at one point early on, I think I pulled them both aside and said, hey, I know you're talking and you're asking questions, but the natural human instinct when there's a pause, an awkward pause, is to fill it. And so they were doing that a lot, but then interrupting one another. And then just as things were getting interesting, they would stop. And so I gave them the therapist/documentarian's trick of just ask a question and shut up. And just stay quiet. And I know it's awkward, and so there was a couple little things there, but my real fear about the 20 days was just like, there's a linear nature to this road trip, and I knew I had to tell it in that way. Usually in my other docs, you can rearrange pieces in the edit.
Right.
But I couldn't take a scene from Arizona up in day 2. And so there was a little fear of, what if they have the most profound conversation on day 1? And the sort of, structure of the film is a mess. We'll make it look like they drove from LA to New York.
Well, I didn't think of that, but a moment for me where the film goes into a different gears is in Indiana, so not far across the country. They go to an NBA Pacers game where they're sitting in the front row because it's Will Ferrell, and the governor of Indiana comes up and talks to him, and Will Ferrell is like, "I'm here with my trans friend," and the governor of Indiana, I don't think, is quite on board with that politically, and it's a moment that was very striking to me because, Will Ferrell is making a political statement in that, not a grandstanding political statement, but Will Ferrell is not Al Franken in his career. This was new for me to kind of see him going out in that way.
Yeah. Well, I think what you see, what I loved watching the film is there's an incredible transformation on both their parts, individually, as a relationship, as a friendship. But you really watch the journey Will goes through in learning what it means to be a friend and be an ally. And in a moment like that, I think even early on, he was interacting with people out in the public, not always saying, "I want you to meet my friend Harper, she just transitioned." Largely not knowing if that's the right first thing to do, You don't always introduce your friend. I'm like, "Hi, this is my friend. They're straight." Like, they're gay. So there's a little step of that, but then, there was moments when, he started to get more and more comfortable. And then, we ran into the governor of Indiana, and they didn't realize it. They're Googling his politics on the sideline. This was after they interacted with him. And I think Will had this moment of growth of realizing, like, I wish I'd asked him. I mean, he talks about in the film the next day, I wish I had said, not in a gotcha moment, but, hey, what are your views on trans people? I've noticed, these bills. And so you can see that kind of growth. But, so much of, I think, what you see Will grappling with is how to be a better friend and how to be a better ally.
I want to ask you about a scene in Texas where they go to this big steakhouse, and Will is kind of playing it like a joke. He dresses up as Sherlock Holmes, but that
I want to say that will make more sense when you see the film, but it won't.
Yeah, the steakhouse has a bet that if you can eat their however
72 ounce
steak. I was going to say 72 pounds, but I guess that
would be hard.
72-ounce steak, like you get it for free. So he makes himself a spectacle, but in this steakhouse, people are taking to social media and saying really vicious things about Harper as a trans woman, and it becomes very tense. And I wonder if you can kind of take us through what you were expecting when you went in that scene, and what it turned into.
Yeah. I mean, the film, certainly the first half of the film, explores, I think, this question that I think is in the trailer just there, of Harper kind of loving this country. She's done these road trips hundreds of times, but not sure if the country loves her back. And so, to an extent, part of the idea of the film and the road trip was for Harper, alongside her sort of safety net of Will, to go into these spaces and find out. We certainly acknowledge in the film, and Harper knows this is not the average trans experience, to be out on the road with Will Ferrell, to be on the road with cameras, which is a whole nother kind of thing we had to work through. So on some level, when we went into these spaces, there's a bar even beforehand in Oklahoma where Harper decides she wants to go in alone, to mitigate this kind of factor of, like, I'm with Will Ferrell. Of course I'm not getting the natural reaction. And we were sort of blown away by, I walked into this bar that was Confederate flags, there was "fuck Biden" posters. There's all sort of the signs of, like, I don't know that this is the right bar to go into, Harper, but she insisted, and she said, these are the kind of bars I'd like to go into. And in that instance, as you'll see in the film, we were all totally shocked with the incredible amount of sort of warmth and acceptance, and even at times in a beautiful way, apathy she was met with. So I think we were lulled into a sense of security. Then we went to this Texas steakhouse. I think we all thought it was just going to be a funny scene where Will was going to try to eat 72 ounces of steak and like you said, it just turned into something very, very different. And again, it's a lesson that I think Will took. I can't explain his Sherlock Holmes outfit now that I'm thinking about it. They used to love to go to, Will and Harper love to surprise each other in costume. For a year, they've known each other for 30 years. They love to go to parties that are not costume parties and show up in costume. and see who can wear the most ridiculous thing. And so Will did wear this Sherlock Holmes costume, I think, to surprise his friend Harper, but in doing so brought an incredible amount of attention on her in a space that was unfriendly. And as you see, unfortunately, in the film, they both were met with a lot of vitriol, largely online, largely on Twitter, but even in the space, to the point where we definitely felt unsafe and got up early and left.
Was that the most harrowing moment of the journey?
I would say no. I think on an outward level, yes, that was very difficult. But I think for me, in Will and Harper, I think it was more the internal moments of pain and struggle that were revealed. You saw a little moment, a bite in the trailer where Harper says, she has a revelation, I think halfway through the trip, where she says, I'm starting to realize that I'm not afraid of others hating me. I think I have a fear of hating myself. And that's really hard to hear. It's hard to hear a friend of yours say, but it's also just, I think we all struggle with that. And so there's a lot of moments like that in the story where it just guts you because there's something just so universal about that. And also, just to be clear, to grow up in the culture that she did, of course a trans person may have transphobia themselves. So I think that was one of the harder ones. And then, again, not to give anything away, but at the end of the film, she takes us to a place, a physical place that she had bought actually out here in the California desert, which is where she was intending to essentially live her life, the rest of her life, alone and in private, where she could, be herself and be a woman. And that was gutted me again as a documentarian behind the camera, but even more so as a friend.
That was Josh Greenbaum, the director of Will and Harper, now streaming on Netflix. Earlier, we heard from Steve Pink, the director of The Last Republican, that's available to Oscar voters on the Academy platform and will be released more widely next year. Our next Documentary Spotlight live event will take place in London, England on November 22nd. If you'd like to follow what we're doing, please subscribe to our newsletter, Doc Voices, written by Bella Racklin. You'll find it on Substack. If you want to advertise to our 40,000 readers, send an email to listen@purenonfiction.net. Thanks to our team, series producer Hannah Norden-Swan and web designer Cross Strategy. Our theme music is composed by Andre Williams, and our executive producer is Raphaela Nahausen. I'm Thom Powers. Follow us on Instagram and visit our website at purenonfiction.net.